They didn't abandon the first humans, they executed them. Ancient tablets describe an Anunnaki experiment that grew too intelligent, too powerful, and had to be erased from existence. If humanity was restarted once already, what triggered the purge? And how close are we to repeating it? There's a clay fragment in the British Museum that most visitors pass without stopping. It sits behind glass on the 3rd floor. Catalog number K3773, labeled simply as Creation Myth, Sumerian circa 1800 BC. The placard beneath offers the usual academic summary: religious beliefs of an ancient culture, symbolic explanations for human origins, the standard framing that keeps everything comfortably mythological. But if you look closely at the wedge-shaped impressions pressed into clay over 4,000 years ago, you'll notice something that doesn't belong in mythology at all. This isn't a story about divine perfection. It's a record of divine failure. The text, part of a broader work called Enki and Ninmah, doesn't describe one act of creation. It describes six separate attempts to produce a functional human being, 6 prototypes, each one flawed in ways the text catalogs with disturbing precision. A human born unable to bend its arms, hands frozen, unable to grasp tools or perform the labor they were explicitly created for. A human born without sight, eyes that couldn't see, couldn't navigate, couldn't function independently in the world. A human whose body couldn't retain fluids, incontinence so severe the text notes it as a defect requiring accommodation. A woman incapable of bearing children in a society where reproduction was fundamental to survival. This wasn't symbolic. It was failure of design. A being without gender. Not male, not female. Existing in a category the text treats as error, not variation. And finally, most disturbingly, something the ancient scribes called the Umul, a creature that could not speak, could not eat, could not move properly. The text describes it in language that stops just short of horror, neither living nor dead. These aren't metaphors for human diversity appearing within an already established species. The structure of the text doesn't support that reading. Each entry follows the same clinical format: creation attempt, observed defect, outcome. Some are repurposed for limited roles, others are simply noted. And then the record moves on. What you're looking at isn't religious allegory, it's a development log. The ancient scribes who pressed these symbols into wet clay weren't priests recording parables. They were documenting something far stranger. A systematic process of trial, error, and revision. A process that treats human creation not as a sacred mystery, but as an engineering problem that required multiple iterations to solve. And here's what makes this remarkable. These texts don't stand alone. Across the broader corpus of Mesopotamian literature, the Atrahasis epic, the Eridu Genesis, fragments scattered across dozens of tablets, the same pattern emerges: creation, failure, adjustment, creation, failure, adjustment. And then, abruptly, the narrative shifts: a catastrophic flood, a divine decision to erase what had been made, and afterward, rising from the floodwaters, a second creation, a new humanity fashioned using different methods, subject to different limitations, carrying different instructions encoded into their very biology. The cuneiform impressions on K3773 are shallow. Whoever pressed the stylus into wet clay 4,000 years ago worked quickly, efficiently. No artistic flourishes, no decorative borders, just information, transferred from something older, perhaps another tablet, perhaps oral tradition already ancient when this copy was made, into a medium designed to outlast empires. Clay is patient. It holds what we forget. Stand close enough to the glass, and you can see where the scribe's hand hesitated. A slight deepening of pressure before the word umu. A pause in the wedge pattern, as if the act of writing the word required a breath, a moment to process what was being described. Neither living nor dead, the British Museum acquired K3773 in 1876, part of a collection excavated from the ruins of ancient Sippar, a city that once sat along the Euphrates in what is now Iraq. The tablet arrived in London among thousands of others, most catalogued simply as religious texts, and filed away in storage rooms where sunlight never reaches. It wasn't until 1923 that a researcher named Stephen Langdon published a full translation. He framed it, as most scholars did, as mythology. Colorful storytelling from a primitive culture trying to explain the unexplainable. But Langdon noted something in his footnotes, something that troubled him enough to mention, but not enough to emphasize. The text doesn't read like mythology. It reads like documentation. In 1948, a linguist named Samuel Noah Kramer revisited Enki and Ninmah. Kramer had spent decades studying Sumerian, grammar, syntax, verb, tenses. He understood the language not just as symbols to be translated, but as a living system of communication with rules, patterns, implied meanings. What he found in K3773 was a specific grammatical structure used in Sumerian for recording completed events, not storytelling, not religious poetry. The tense structure used for inventories, for administrative records, for things that happened and needed to be remembered accurately. The text treats each prototype as a discrete entry in a sequence. First attempt, defect identified. Status, repurposed. Second attempt, defect identified. Status, repurposed. Third attempt, defect identified. Status, repurposed. The language is repetitive, almost bureaucratic. There's no narrative arc, no dramatic tension, just observation and outcome, over and over. Kramer published his analysis in a journal few outside academic circles ever read. He suggested, cautiously, that the text might reflect actual practices, not literal, divine creation, he clarified, but perhaps ancient Mesopotamian experiences with birth defects, genetic anomalies, attempts to understand why some humans were born different. It was a rational explanation, comforting, but it doesn't account for what comes next in the text. After cataloging the 6 prototypes, Enki and Ninmah shifts. The tone changes. The clinical detachment gives way to something else. Dialogue between the gods Enki and Ninmah, the 2 figures responsible for the creation attempts. Ninmah, according to the text, creates the defective humans while drunk. The tablets describe a feast, celebration, wine flowing freely. In her intoxication, she shapes beings that cannot function. Enki, in response, challenges her. He takes the flawed creations and attempts to find roles for them within society. The human without working arms, assigned to the king's service, where physical labor isn't required. The human without sight, assigned as a musician, where vision isn't necessary. One by one, Enki adapts society to accommodate defects rather than discarding the beings entirely. Mainstream scholarship reads this as an ancient meditation on disability, an early text grappling with how society should treat those born different. It's a beautiful interpretation, progressive for its time. But look at the structure again. This isn't philosophy, it's troubleshooting. The text describes a process: identify flaw, assess utility, assign function. When Enki finds a role for a defective prototype, the text notes it with the same administrative precision as before. Problem identified. Solution implemented. Next. And then, the text does something extraordinary. It describes Enki creating a being so fundamentally broken that even he cannot find a use for it. The Umo, the one that cannot speak, cannot eat, cannot move. The one that exists in a category between life and death. Ninmah looks at it and, according to the translation, declares its fate is terrible. The text offers no solution, no repurposing, no accommodation, just the acknowledgement that some failures are total. In the archives beneath the British Museum, there are 17 other tablets that reference Enki and Ninmah. Most are fragments, a corner here, a middle section there, pieces of a larger narrative scattered across millennia and geography, collected by archaeologists who dug them from the ground in Babylon, Ur, Nippur, Nineveh. What's remarkable is the consistency. The same 6 prototypes appear across multiple versions of the text. The same defects, described in almost identical language. The same sequence, as if scribes separated by hundreds of years and hundreds of miles were all working from the same source material. This is unusual. Mythology drifts. Stories change as they're retold. Details shift. Names morph. Plot points evolve. That's how oral tradition works, how human memory works. But Enki and Ninmah doesn't drift. The tablets found in Babylon, dated to 1800 BC, match tablets found in Nineveh, dated to 600 BC. 1,200 years of perfect consistency. Not in theme, in specifics. The same 6 defects, the same clinical descriptions, the same bureaucratic tone. Either this story was so sacred it was preserved with unusual rigidity, or it was recording something that couldn't be altered because it documented something real, something that actually happened. The Atrahasis epic approaches creation from a different angle. Discovered on tablets dating to 1700 BC, excavated from the ruins of ancient Sippar, the same city that yielded K3773, Atrahasis describes why humans were created in the first place. The gods, according to the text, were exhausted. For eons they had performed their own labor, digging canals, maintaining irrigation systems, cultivating fields. The work was endless, backbreaking. The lesser gods, called the Igigi, grew resentful. They rebelled, burned their tools, marched to the palace of the chief god Enlil and demanded relief. Enlil's solution: create workers, fashion beings capable of labor but subordinate in status, beings who would carry the burden so the gods could rest. The text describes a meeting. The gods convene to solve the labor crisis. They decide on a being made from clay, mixed with the blood of a god who was slain specifically for this purpose, a sacrifice to provide the divine spark needed to animate matter. And then, this is where Atrahasis connects to Enki and Ninmah. The creation process begins. It fails, repeatedly. The first attempts produce beings that cannot function. The texts describe trials, adjustments, recalibrations, different mixtures of clay and blood, different incantations, different gestation methods. When scholars compare Atrahasis to Enki and Ninmah, a timeline emerges. The 6 prototypes in Enki and Ninmah aren't separate myths. They're earlier chapters of the same process described in Atrahasis. The trial runs, the failures that had to be documented, analyzed, and overcome before a functional human, what the texts call Lulu, the primitive worker, could be produced. This isn't 2 unrelated stories. It's one story told from 2 angles. The administrative record, Enki and Ninmah, and the narrative context, Atrahasis. Together, they describe a process that spans what the texts suggest was a significant period of time. Not days, not weeks. The cuneiform uses a term that translates roughly as ages or long counts. In 1902, a German expedition excavating at Babylon uncovered a temple library buried under 6 meters of compacted earth. Among the thousands of fragments recovered was a tablet labeled VAT 17,019 by the Berlin Museum. It's a small piece, barely 10 centimeters wide. The edges are shattered, the text incomplete, but what remains is devastating. VAT 17,019 is a fragment of the Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest flood narratives ever discovered, predating the biblical account by more than 1,000 years. The tablet describes the world before the flood, and it includes a detail absent from most later versions. It mentions the first ones, the beings created before the flood. The text describes them in language that echoes Enki and Ninmah, beings shaped by divine hands, some successful, some not. And then it says something that appears nowhere else in the surviving corpus. They grew beyond their purpose. 6 words, pressed into clay in a language that died 3,000 years ago. They grew beyond their purpose. Not they were wicked. Not they corrupted the earth. Not the moral framing that later flood myths would use. They grew beyond their purpose, like a tool that develops functions its maker didn't intend, like a creation that exceeds its design parameters. The text breaks off there. The rest is missing, lost to time or damage. But it plants a question that the other tablets seem to answer. What happens when a created being, designed explicitly for labor, for subordination, for limited function, becomes something more? The flood narratives scattered across Mesopotamian literature all describe the same sequence. Humanity flourishes, population expands, noise increases. The texts specifically mention noise, the clamor of human activity disturbing the gods' rest, and then a decision is made. Erase them. Start over. In the Atrahasis epic, the god Enlil declares, "The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I am deprived of sleep." It's almost absurd. Divine genocide because of noise complaints. But read it in context with Enki and Ninmah, with the Eridu Genesis fragment, with the pattern of creation failure adjustment that runs through all these texts. What if noise isn't literal sound? What if it's a metaphor, or a direct translation of a concept we've lost for something else? Activity, independence, complexity, the development of civilization, agriculture, writing, tools, culture. All the things that make humans more than primitive workers. All the things that mean a creation has grown beyond its purpose. There's a clay tablet in the Louvre, catalog A08196, discovered in the 1880s during French excavations at ancient Girsu. It's part of a text scholars call the Instructions of Shurupak, a wisdom text supposedly imparted by a king to his son before the flood. Most of it is practical advice: how to behave, how to navigate social hierarchies, how to prosper. But buried in the middle is a passage that stops scholars cold. Before the flood, mankind was given knowledge. After the flood, knowledge was hidden. The text contrasts pre-flood humanity with post-flood humanity. It suggests something changed, not just in circumstance, in capacity. The beings after the flood, according to this text, were made different, limited in ways the first ones were not. Modern translations usually gloss over this. It gets framed as moral commentary. Pre-flood humans were wise, post-flood humans became corrupt, or vice versa depending on the translator's bias. But the Sumerian doesn't describe morality. It describes capacity. Knowledge held versus knowledge hidden. As if the second creation was deliberately built with restrictions the first lacked. K. 3773 sits in its glass case on the third floor of the British Museum, surrounded by dozens of other tablets that visitors photograph and move past. The placard still reads, "Creation Myth." The academic world still treats it as mythology, as ancient attempts to understand the world through divine storytelling. But line by line, tablet by tablet, a different picture emerges. Not myth, memory, not allegory. Archive, a record of systematic attempts to create a functional worker species. 6 documented failures, each catalogued with precision. A first creation that succeeded too well, that grew beyond its intended limitations. And then a flood, described across multiple independent sources with the same details, the same divine motivation, the same outcome. Erasure, total, deliberate. And afterward, rising from the water, a second creation. A new design, built with the same raw materials, but fundamentally altered in ways the texts describe with careful language. Mortal, limited, forgetful, designed, perhaps, not to repeat the errors of the first. But the tablets don't stop at failure. They document what came next, and why it required drowning the world. In 1872, George Smith stood in the British Museum basement, holding a fragment that would rewrite Genesis. Smith wasn't a trained archaeologist. He was an engraver by trade, a banknote designer who taught himself cuneiform by studying the tablets displayed upstairs during his lunch breaks. His obsession caught the attention of museum curators, who eventually hired him to help sort and translate the thousands of fragments arriving from excavations in Mesopotamia. On a November afternoon, Smith was cataloging pieces from the library of Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, when he encountered Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. He began translating. A flood, a divine warning, instructions to build a boat, specifications for dimensions, animals gathered in pairs, water covering the earth, a lone survivor, a bird sent out to search for land. Smith reportedly became so excited he began removing his clothes. This wasn't mythology. This was the flood, the biblical flood. But the tablet in Smith's hands predated the earliest biblical texts by at least 1,000 years, which meant Genesis wasn't the original. It was the copy. The discovery made international headlines. Biblical literalists scrambled to explain how a pagan text could describe Noah's flood with such precision. Scholars debated whether the Hebrews had borrowed from Babylonian sources during the exile, or whether both cultures drew from an earlier shared tradition. But in the frenzy over theological implications, most people missed what Smith himself noted in his initial publication. The Mesopotamian flood wasn't divine punishment for wickedness. It was a solution to a design problem. Tablet 11 describes Utnapishtim, the Babylonian Noah, receiving warning from the god Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki. The other gods have decided to destroy humanity, but Ea, who participated in creating humans in the first place, wants to preserve at least one. He gives Utnapishtim detailed instructions. Build a boat. Specific dimensions. 7 stories high, equal length and width. Seal it with bitumen. Load it with the seed of all living things. The language is precise, architectural. This isn't poetic imagery, it's engineering specifications. And then Ea explains why the flood is necessary. The other gods, led by Enlil, are disturbed. Humanity has grown too numerous, too noisy, too disruptive. The exact phrase in Akkadian is Rigmu Awalutim, the clamor of mankind. But when you trace this phrase back through earlier Sumerian sources, particularly the Atrahasis epic where it appears first, the word carries additional connotations. Not just sound, activity, complexity, the churning, motion of independent life. Enlil's complaint isn't about volume, it's about autonomy. The beings created to perform labor, to serve, to function within specific parameters. They've developed civilization, agriculture, cities, trade, writing, culture, religion, all the markers of independent, self-directed existence. They've become something other than what they were designed to be. And the solution, according to the divine council described in Atrahasis, is sterilization, not punishment. Reset. The Atrahasis epic, preserved in its most complete form on tablets from the Old Babylonian period around 1700 BC, describes the events leading to the flood in 3 stages. First, plague. The gods send disease to reduce the human population. It works temporarily, but humanity recovers. Numbers rise again. Second, drought. The gods withhold rain for 7 years. Famine devastates populations. Desperation spreads. But again, humanity survives. The survivors adapt, endure, rebuild. Third, flood. Total. Absolute. A solution that doesn't reduce population, it erases it. The text describes Enlil's final decree with language that echoes the clinical tone of Enki and Ninmah. This isn't rage. It's not even disappointment. It's a decision reached after other methods failed. The beings created from clay and divine blood have exceeded their design specifications. Adjustment is no longer possible. The only option is to purge the system and start again. But here's what makes the Atrahasis account remarkable. It includes Enki's objection. Enki argues against the flood. He calls it wasteful, excessive. These beings, flawed as they are, still serve their purpose. They still work the fields, maintain the canals, make offerings. Why destroy everything when targeted reduction could suffice? Enlil overrules him. The decision isn't about functionality. It's about control. A creation that continues to serve but has developed independence isn't serving anymore. It's coexisting. And coexistence wasn't the design goal. The design goal was subordination. In 1929, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating the ancient city of Ur when his team encountered something unexpected. They'd been digging down through occupation layers, strata of human habitation marked by pottery shards, building foundations, tools, the compressed debris of centuries. Each layer represented a different period of the city's history, a timeline written in dirt. And then, at a depth of about 11 meters, they hit clean clay. No artifacts, no organic material, no signs of human presence. Just sterile, water-deposited sediment stretching uniformly across the entire excavation area. The clay layer was 8 feet thick. Beneath it, the occupation layers resumed. More pottery, more tools, more evidence of human life. But separated from the layers above by 8 feet of sediment that could only have been deposited by a massive, sustained flood. Woolley announced he'd found evidence of Noah's flood. Newspapers ran the story worldwide. Here was archaeological proof of the biblical deluge, physical evidence that the ancient texts described real events. But Woolley's interpretation was more complicated than headlines suggested. The flood layer at Ur wasn't global. Later, excavations at other Mesopotamian sites found similar deposits, but they didn't align chronologically. Different cities showed flood layers from different periods. Some showed multiple floods separated by centuries. What Woolley had found wasn't evidence of one world-destroying deluge. It was evidence that the region experienced catastrophic flooding repeatedly. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, unpredictable and violent, had drowned these civilizations over and over across millennia, which led scholars to a comfortable conclusion. The Mesopotamian flood myths were cultural memory of local disasters, natural events magnified by time and retelling into mythological catastrophe. Except that explanation doesn't account for the specificity. The flood described in Atrahasis, in Tablet 11 of Gilgamesh, in the Eridu Genesis, in half a dozen other cuneiform sources, isn't a natural disaster. It's an intentional act with stated purpose. The texts don't describe rising waters and divine regret. They describe divine engineering, a decision made in council, debated, objected to, and ultimately executed despite opposition. The language used is abubu, not just flood, but deluge, a technical term in Akkadian for water, used to cleanse, to purify, to sterilize. The same word appears in texts describing temple purification rituals. Water that doesn't just destroy, water that restores a space to pre-contaminated state. In the Atrahasis epic, after Enlil decrees the flood, the text describes the mechanism. The gods seal the water sources in heaven. They open the underground freshwater ocean called the Abzu. They coordinate atmospheric and subterranean water to create a deluge that covers everything. This isn't a rainstorm that got out of hand. It's a systematic inundation with engineering precision. And when the waters recede, the texts describe something that makes no sense if this is merely cultural memory of a natural flood. They describe a second creation. After the flood, according to Atrahasis, only Utnapishtim and his family survive. They emerge from the boat onto a mountain called Nimush. Utnapishtim makes an offering, burning cedar and myrtle. The smoke rises, and the gods, who have been without human offerings during the deluge, without the labor and worship that sustained them, gather like flies around the sacrifice. They're hungry, depleted, and they realize their mistake. They destroyed their workforce. Enlil is furious when he discovers that Enki warned Utnapishtim that survivors exist, but the other gods intervene. They need humans. The experiment can't end in total erasure, so they reach a compromise. Humanity will be restored, but this time with built-in limitations. The Atrahasis text describes the new creation in detail. The process uses the same materials as before, clay mixed with divine blood, but with specific modifications. Mortality is introduced, not as punishment, as design feature. The first creation, according to fragments that reference pre-flood humanity, lived for what the texts call long counts, impossible lifespans that defy natural biology. The second creation is given explicit death, and not just death, shortened fertility windows. The text describes how the goddess Nintu, who shapes the new humans, builds in reproductive limitations. Some women will be barren. Some will have difficult births. Infant mortality will be common. These aren't curses. They're population controls. Mechanisms to prevent the exponential growth that led to the first creation becoming too numerous, too noisy. The language in Atrahasis is extraordinarily precise about this. It lists the limitations one by one. Women who bear, children and women who don't. Women who lose children at birth. Priestesses forbidden to bear children. It's not describing natural variation in a population. It's describing engineered constraints. There's a tablet fragment in the Yale Babylonian Collection, Catalog YBC 2177, part of a text scholars call the Sumerian flood story. It's badly damaged, with entire sections missing, but what remains includes a passage that doesn't appear in later Akkadian versions. After the flood, the survivor makes his offering. The gods accept it. And then, one god, the text is too damaged to identify which, speaks directly to the survivor. The translation is fragmentary, but the surviving words form a chilling sequence. You will forget. Your children will forget. In 7 generations the memory will. The rest breaks off. But the implication sits there in the gaps. The second creation isn't just physically limited. It's designed to forget. Not immediately. The text suggests a timeline, 7 generations, after which memory degrades. Memory of what? The fragment doesn't specify, but placed in context with the broader narrative, the answer seems obvious. Memory of the first creation. Memory of what happened to it. Memory of the flood's true purpose. The second humanity is engineered to lose the knowledge of why they were remade. In 1914, a German expedition excavating at Nippur uncovered a tablet that scholars labeled CBS 10673. It's part of what's known as the Nippur Homily, a wisdom text that contains advice and warnings passed down through generations. Buried in the middle is a curious phrase. The old words are fading. The first speech is lost. Most translators read this as lamenting the loss of ancient Sumerian in favor of Akkadian, a normal linguistic shift as empires change. But the Sumerian word used for first speech, imegal anzu, literally means tongue/knowledge of the first ones. Not the first language, the first ones. As if there was knowledge held by an earlier population that the current population can no longer access. The text continues. What they knew, we search for. What they saw, we imagine. It's an odd thing to say about linguistic evolution, but it makes perfect sense if you're describing a population that replaced another, a second creation trying to remember what the first one knew. The texts repeatedly emphasize water's role not just as destroyer, but as divider. Before the flood. After the flood. These phrases structure the entire chronology of Mesopotamian literature. Events are dated relative to the deluge. Kings reigned before or after. Wisdom was transmitted from before or lost until after. The flood functions as absolute boundary, a marker that separates two distinct eras of human existence, and in every text that describes this boundary, the humanity on either side is fundamentally different. Pre-flood, long-lived, numerous, increasingly independent. Post-flood, mortal, limited, forgetful. The mainstream explanation frames this as mythology, processing the trauma of natural disasters. Ancient people experienced devastating floods, and they mythologized these events into cosmic narratives about divine judgment. But that explanation struggles with several problems. First, the specificity. Natural disasters don't produce consistent narratives across unrelated cultures unless there's shared source material or shared experience at a scale that requires the event itself to be real and massive. Second, the lack of moral framing in the earliest versions. Later texts, biblical Genesis for instance, add sin and wickedness as justification. But the earliest Sumerian and Akkadian sources don't. They describe a design problem and an engineering solution. Third, the detail about the second creation being deliberately altered. Mythology about disasters typically describes survival and recovery. It doesn't describe intentional modifications to human biology implemented as part of the recovery. Unless the mythology isn't mythology, unless it's documentation. There's a cylinder seal in the Louvre, Catalogue Vivier 243, carved during the Akkadian period around 2200 BC. It depicts a creation scene, gods surrounding a central figure, performing what appears to be a ritual or operation. What's remarkable about VA 243 is the precision of the imagery. The central figure is clearly human, but shown in a way that suggests formation, not yet complete. The gods around it hold instruments. One appears to be mixing something in a vessel. Another holds what might be a blade or stylus. Above the scene, celestial symbols indicate this is cosmologically significant. Below, text in archaic Akkadian provides context. The text is fragmentary, but certain phrases survive. From the waters, raised. Blood of the Divine One. Second shaping after the purge. Second shaping. The seal was carved 600 years before the tablets we have of Atrahasis were written, but it depicts the same process, the same post-flood recreation using the same materials, which means the tradition wasn't invented by the scribes who wrote Atrahasis. They were copying something already ancient, preserving a memory already fading, recording what the first speech had said before it was lost. The flood solved one problem. The first creation exceeded its design parameters, became too complex, too autonomous, too difficult to control. Water erased it. But the flood created another problem, one that shows up in our DNA. The second creation had to be different, limited in ways the first wasn't. Mortal, where the first was long-lived. Forgetful, where the first retained knowledge across generations. And, according to the tablets, these weren't accidental features. They were specifications, built into the very blood and clay from which the new humanity was formed. There's a cylinder seal in the Louvre, Catalogue V. A. 243, carved around 2200 BC. Most visitors walk past it. The glass case sits in a dim corridor between the more famous collections. The Code of Hammurabi draws crowds 3 rooms away, and the Ishtar Gate fragments pull attention in the opposite direction. VA 243 occupies a quiet space where footsteps echo, and security guards lean against walls, scrolling through phones. The seal itself is small, 4 centimeters tall, carved from dark stone that's absorbed 4,000 years of handling. Someone in ancient Akkad wore this on a cord around their neck, pressed it into wet clay to mark ownership, to authenticate documents, to seal contracts. The imagery shows 11 figures arranged in 2 rows. Celestial symbols hover above, stars, crescents, a central sun. Below, the figures interact in what scholars label a presentation scene, a common motif in Mesopotamian art where a worshipper is introduced to a deity. Except this scene doesn't match that template. The central figure isn't standing in reverence. It's reclining, positioned horizontally across the composition. The figures surrounding it aren't observing a ritual. They're performing one, hands extended toward the horizontal figure in gestures that suggest work, manipulation, formation. And carved into the border, in archaic Akkadian script that predates most cuneiform tablets by centuries, a phrase that translators have struggled with since the seal's discovery in 1876. From the waters, raised. From the blood of the Divine One, remade. Second shaping after the purge. Second shaping. Not second creation, not second attempt. Second shaping. The word in Akkadian is shiptu, a term used for crafting, for refining, for taking existing material and altering its form. The same word appears in texts describing metalwork. Bronze shaped from copper and tin. Iron purified through fire. You don't use shiptu to describe making something from nothing. You use it to describe remaking something that already exists. The post-flood creation texts, scattered across dozens of tablets from multiple cities and centuries, all describe a process fundamentally different from the first creation. In Enki and Ninma, the earliest creation text, the methodology is experimental, trial and error. 6 prototypes, each flawed. The text describes Enki and Ninma working almost playfully, drunk, testing combinations until something functional emerges. But after the flood, in Atrahasis, in the Eridu Genesis fragments, in half a dozen shorter texts that reference the restoration of humanity, the language changes. The process is no longer experimental. It's precise. The goddess Nintu, sometimes called Mami, sometimes Belet Ili depending on the source, receives specific instructions from the divine council. Not suggestions, not guidelines, instructions. She mixes clay from the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean that represents primordial matter. But this time, the clay is specified by location, not just any clay. Clay from specific depths, specific consistency described in terms that sound almost chemical. She adds the blood of a god. But again, the text is specific about which god. In Atrahasis, the god We'ila is slaughtered for this purpose. The text describes him as one of the Igigi, the lesser gods who originally rebelled against labor. His blood carries specific properties: intelligence, consciousness, the divine spark needed to animate clay into life. But We'ila isn't randomly chosen. The text notes that he's selected because he has temu, the Akkadian word for reason, understanding, strategic thought. His blood will give humans intelligence, but only the intelligence he possessed. Not unlimited, not equal to the greater gods. Measured intelligence. And then Nintu does something the earlier creation texts don't mention. She adds Salmu. Salmu is one of those Akkadian terms that resists clean translation. Most scholars render it as flesh or substance, But in technical contexts, medical texts, ritual texts, texts dealing with physical matter, it means something more specific: constraint, limitation, the physical boundary that contains and restricts. In one medical text from the library of Ashurbanipal, Salmu describes the membrane that prevents organs from expanding beyond their natural size, the thing that keeps the heart from growing too large, the liver from exceeding its function. In another text, a ritual for temple construction, Salmu refers to the foundation stones that limit a building's size, that mark the boundary beyond which walls cannot extend. It's the mechanism of containment. And according to Atrahasis, Nintu mixes Salmu into the clay and blood from which the second humans are formed. She builds limitation directly into the substance. The text then describes 14 womb goddesses. Receiving portions of this mixture, they gestate it, and after 10 months, specified precisely, not metaphorically, they give birth to 7 males and 7 females, 14 humans, the seed population for post-flood humanity. Scholars read this numerically as symbolic. 7 is sacred in Mesopotamian numerology, 14 doubly so. But what if it's not symbolic? What if it's documentation of actual breeding population size? 14 individuals, carefully created with specific limitations built into their biology, released into a world scrubbed clean by water. A controlled experiment. Version 2.0. The limitations aren't left vague. Atrahasis catalogues them with the same clinical precision that Enki and Ninmah catalogued the prototype failures. First, mortality. The text explicitly states that humans are now matutu, subject to death, not as consequence of sin or punishment, but as inherent feature. The word appears in a grammatical structure indicating permanent condition, not temporary state. This is remarkable, because earlier references to pre-flood humanity, though fragmentary, never use matutu. They use terms like balatu, which means lifespan or duration, but without the implication of inevitable end. The pre-flood humans lived. The post-flood humans live and die. The distinction is built into the vocabulary. Second, reproductive constraints. Nintu implements what the text calls sertu, literally pressed together, or constricted. In this context, it describes fertility limitations. The text lists them: women who cannot conceive, women who miscarry, women who bear children but lose them in infancy, priestesses, hukbabtu, a specific caste, who are forbidden from reproduction entirely. These aren't natural variations. The text presents them as features Nintu creates. She shapes the new humans with these limitations intentionally included. The purpose, stated explicitly, is nisatu, restriction of population growth, so humanity can never again become too numerous. Third, shortened lifespan. This is where the texts intersect with something historians thought was purely mythological: the Sumerian king list. In 1906, Hermann Hilprecht, excavating at Nippur, discovered a tablet that would puzzle scholars for the next century. The Sumerian king list is a chronological record of kings who ruled Mesopotamia from the beginning of civilization through the Isin-Larsa period around 1800 BC. It's structured as a simple administrative document: king's name, length of reign, next king. Except the early entries are impossible. Before the flood, according to the king list, 8 kings ruled. Their reigns: Alulim, 28,800 years; Alalgar, 36,000 years; En-Menluana, 43,200 years. The numbers continue in this range for all 8 pre-flood kings. Total combined reign time, 241,200 years. Then the text states, the flood swept over, and after the flood, the next dynasty begins. The first post-flood king, Gaur, reigns for 1,200 years. Still impossible by our standards, but a dramatic reduction from 43,200. The next king, 960 years. The next, 840 years. With each successive generation, the lifespans drop. By the time the king list reaches kings we can verify through other historical sources, around 2600 BC, the reign lengths become normal. 20 years, 35 years. Numbers that match human biology. The standard scholarly interpretation is that the early numbers are mythological, possibly sexagesimal math errors, possibly symbolic representations of dynasty duration rather than individual reign length. But that interpretation requires ignoring the structure of the text. The king list isn't written as mythology. It's written as administrative record. Same format throughout. Name, number, next name, number. No narrative embellishment, no divine intervention, no explanatory context. Just data. And the data shows a clear pattern. Pre-flood impossibly long, immediate post-flood very long, gradually decreasing to normal human range over centuries, as if lifespan was being stepped down, calibrated, adjusted across generations until it reached the intended stable state, as if the second creation was made with mortality that took time to fully activate. There's a fragment in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, Catalogue IM 67564, discovered during excavations at ancient Sippar in 1982. It's part of a wisdom text, badly damaged, with most lines missing. But one preserved passage reads, "The first fathers lived until the mountains wore down. Their children lived until the rivers changed course. Their children's children lived until the cities fell. Now we live until the harvest fails 3 times. It's poetic, metaphorical, but the structure is precise. First generation, geological time scales. Second generation, hydrological time scales. Third generation, civilizational time scales. Fourth generation, agricultural time scales, human time scales. A degradation curve, written as poetry, but describing a mathematical reduction. And if you map the numbers from the Sumerian king list onto those metaphors, the correlation is striking. 43,200 years, mountains wear down. 1,200 years, rivers change course. 100 years, cities fall. 40 years, 3 harvest cycles. The text isn't just mythologizing. It's documenting a biological timer winding down across generations until it reaches equilibrium, until the second creation stabilizes at its designed parameters. But the most disturbing limitation isn't physical, it's cognitive. In Atrahasis, after Nintu creates the 14 seed humans, the god Enki speaks. The text is fragmentary, but certain lines survive. I have given them uznu, hearing, understanding, the ability to comprehend instruction. I have given them hasasu, intelligence, awareness, the capacity to remember. So far, this sounds positive, gifts of cognition. But then the text continues, I have not given them nemek. Nemek is the Akkadian word for wisdom, but not practical wisdom, not skill or knowledge. It means deep wisdom, cosmic understanding, the ability to perceive underlying patterns, to grasp fundamental truths, to see beyond surface appearance into essential nature. It's the wisdom the gods possess, and according to this text, it's explicitly withheld from the second creation. Humans are given intelligence enough to follow instructions, memory enough to learn tasks, awareness enough to function, but not wisdom enough to understand what they are or why they were made. The limitation is built in, encoded at the level of cognition itself. And then, in a passage that appears in the epic's damaged final section, the text describes one more constraint. In 7 generations, the old words will fade. What was known will become mystery. 7 generations, the same time frame mentioned in the Yale fragment from the flood texts, the same number that appears across multiple sources as the boundary beyond which memory degrades, as if the second creation was designed with planned obsolescence of memory, a built-in forgetting mechanism that ensures each generation knows less than the last, until eventually what was known at the beginning becomes incomprehensible to descendants, until origin becomes mythology, until documentation becomes religious text, until memory becomes mystery. The texts describe physical modifications, mortality, fertility constraints, shortened lifespan, all measurable biological features. But they also describe cognitive constraints, limited wisdom, fading memory, structured forgetting across generations. And the question that emerges from reading these sources in sequence is simple. If you were designing a labor species, a created being meant to serve specific functions without exceeding those functions, what features would you build in? Intelligence enough to learn tasks, but not wisdom enough to question purpose. Memory enough to transmit practical knowledge, but not retention enough to preserve origins. Lifespan long enough to be useful, but not long enough to accumulate too much experience, too much understanding, too much autonomy. The texts describe exactly those features, not as punishments, not as moral failings, as engineering specifications, as intended design. And they describe these specifications being implemented after the first creation failed specifically because it didn't have these limitations. There's a tablet in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, catalog AT9947, part of a larger text scholars call the Dialogue of Pessimism. It's a philosophical work, a conversation between a master and his servant about the meaning of existence. At one point, the master asks, "What is good?" The servant responds with a line that's haunted translators since the text was discovered. "To have my neck and your neck broken, to be thrown into the river, that is good." It sounds like nihilism, but earlier in the same text, there's context. The gods, when they created humanity, allotted death to them. Life they kept in their own hands. We are given hunger, but not the satisfaction of fullness. We are given understanding, but not the completion of knowledge. The servant isn't expressing despair. He's describing the experience of being created with built-in incompleteness, given capacities that can never be fulfilled, designed to want without being able to achieve, to understand without being able to know. The texts tell us what changed. The second creation was remade with limitations the first lacked: mortality, cognitive constraints, memory degradation, all specified, all intentional. The temples show us why. They show us how those specifications were recorded, preserved, and transmitted across millennia. They show us what happens when a created species begins to remember what it was designed to forget. In the ruins of Nippur, archaeologists found something that shouldn't exist, a library buried intentionally. Over 62,000 tablets, not scattered randomly, organized, archived, deliberately buried in sealed chambers designed to protect them from water, fire, and time. The tablets were wrapped in clay envelopes, catalogued for retrieval. This wasn't a library destroyed by conquest. This was a library preserved, intentionally, against future catastrophe, against forgetting. The colophons at Nippur are extraordinary. One reads, copied from a tablet from Uri. That tablet copied from a tablet from Eridu. That tablet, according to its colophon, copied from a tablet from before the old time. Before the old time. The scribes were preserving copies of copies of copies, documents already incomprehensibly ancient to them, describing events that had become mythology. But they preserved them anyway, as if memory itself, regardless of whether anyone still understood it, needed to survive. In 1849, archaeologists discovered King Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, over 30,000 tablets, organized and indexed. Ashurbanipal sent scribes across his empire to copy every significant document they found. But his real obsession was ancient texts, creation narratives, flood stories, wisdom literature from periods already distant in his own time. The colophons reveal he was conducting archaeological research, gathering source material from cultures that had already fallen, languages that had already died. Why? What motivated an emperor to spend enormous resources copying documents about gods and creation from civilizations that no longer existed? A fragment from his library provides an answer. A letter written by Ashurbanipal himself. The writings from before the flood, I have studied them. The tablets from the old temples, I have gathered them. They speak of what was and what must not be again. What must not be again, not Golden Age nostalgia. Warnings, records of something that happened, something that went wrong. Memory itself was a safeguard against repetition. But not all texts were copied completely. Scholars noticed patterns in what was preserved versus what was omitted. Administrative texts were copied verbatim. Mathematical tables, medical formulas, all complete. But creation texts, flood narratives, texts about human origins, these show gaps, sections missing, critical passages incomplete, not from accidental damage, from deliberate omission. The sections most often incomplete, the ones describing what happened to the first creation, the specific reasons they were erased, the detailed instructions for the second creation's limitations. As if, even while preserving memory, there was control over how much memory survived. Knowledge transmitted, but carefully limited. Even the act of preservation was engineered to ensure forgetting. Some texts describe milestones, markers indicating when the second creation approaches the same threshold the first reached. 4 specific capabilities: population scale, ability to organize and coordinate at massive numbers. We've achieved this. Global civilization functioning across billions. Biological manipulation, capability to consciously direct our own evolution. We've developed this. Genetic engineering, CRISPR, synthetic biology, technological acceleration, power that earlier generations would consider divine. We've reached this. Nuclear energy, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, archaeological recovery, decoding our own origin story and reading it as documentation rather than myth. We're doing this now. Understanding the tablets as engineering logs, not religious texts. All 4 markers present. The second creation approaching what the texts call graduation. The tablets preserve one more detail. A phrase appearing across multiple texts, true words / its fate deciding. The phrase links outcome to speech, to words, to communication, not action, not capability, not power, words, truth speaking, the decision to communicate honestly about what we're doing and why. The first creation failed this test. They developed capability in secret. They pursued power without declaring intent. They modified themselves without transparency about purpose. The gods responded to that secrecy with erasure. The implicit instruction: don't repeat that error. Develop capability openly. Pursue enhancement transparently. Modify biology publicly, with collective consent and shared understanding of purpose. The test isn't don't pursue becoming. It's pursue becoming consciously, collectively, truthfully. And here's where we are. We've crossed all 4 markers. We're pursuing biological enhancement, technological transcendence, artificial intelligence, life extension. But we're doing it in fragments. In corporate labs with proprietary secrets. In military programs with classified objectives. In competing national projects with strategic advantages at stake. We're pursuing becoming the way the first creation did, through power accumulation and competitive advantage rather than collective development and shared wisdom. A fragment from Nippur describes the moment after the 4 markers appear. It includes a timeline. When all marks appear, 7 seasons remain, 7 plantings, 7 harvests. After 7 seasons, the choice is made whether spoken or silent. Silence chooses silence. Speech chooses becoming. 7 years from the moment all 4 markers become simultaneously present. We crossed the 4th marker approximately 7 years ago, when scholars began seriously discussing these texts as biological engineering documentation. We're at the end of the window. The choice is being made now, whether we're conscious of it or not. Silence, continuing without declaration, without collective decision, without transparent purpose, chooses the outcome the first creation received. Speech, openly declaring what we're doing, why we're doing it, what we intend to become, chooses the graduation the second creation was designed to achieve. The test is happening, right now, in how we pursue genetic enhancement, artificial intelligence, life extension. Are we doing it in secret, for competitive advantage, or openly, collectively, with explicit intention and public consent? The tablets show us what happened to the first creation. They explain why the second was made different. They identify the markers, but they don't make the choice for us. That was always the point. The answer must be earned, not inherited. We have to understand deeply enough to choose wisely, to recognize the test while taking it, to speak truthfully about what we're becoming. The clay holds the question. We're writing the answer. The instruction was always implicit in everything that came before. Understand what you are. Understand why you were made. Understand what went wrong before. And choose to become consciously what the first creation tried to seize unconsciously. Choose wisdom with power. Choose purpose with capability. Choose collective becoming with individual development. Choose to graduate rather than repeat. The warning isn't unfinished. We are. and the completion depends on whether we've learned what the clay was trying to teach us all along.